All right, let's dive in, folks. We've had a ton of requests to take a closer look at the situation in Ukraine, and, well, you asked for it. This isn't just going to be a surface-level news rundown, though, okay?
Yeah.
We're going deeper. We're going to try to get into the heads of the people who are living this, experiencing this day in and day out. And trust me, it gets complicated fast.
Yeah. No sugarcoating here.
Exactly.
Maybe the best place to start is, well, inside Ukraine itself. There's this tension, right, between the civilians and the military. There was this incident, a civilian killed a military official, straight up. It was a protest against the forced conscription that's been going on.
Whoa, okay. A civilian killing a military official, that's definitely a major red flag. Got to be some serious heat around that. But what's the backstory here? Was this like a one-off thing? Or is there a bigger picture we're missing?
See, that's the thing. It took ages for the top brass, the Ukrainian leadership, to even say anything about it.
Really?
Yeah, finally, General Sirkisky, he kind of admitted that maybe the military recruitment offices, they call them TCKs, had pushed things too far.
Kind of admitted, huh?
Yeah, like it was an afterthought almost.
So not exactly a full-blown condemnation of what that civilian did.
Nope, and that's what's got people talking, you know, because there's this whole history of allegations about these TCKs abusing civilians, and those incidents, well, they didn't seem to get this much attention.
So there's this sense of a double standard then. Maybe something even more deliberate going on.
You got it. There's this theory floating around that the Ukrainian government has been purposely creating this rift, this bad blood between civilian and military. And get this, some are saying it's been going on since March 2022.
Hold up, back up. Why would they do that? What's the end game in stirring up that kind of trouble?
It's messy. But one idea is that it's all about control, right? And who to blame
Ukraine to
go wrong. Go back to 2022, there was this whole thing where a big-time military leader was being investigated for treason.
Okay, yeah, now that you mention it, that does sound a little fishy, especially if we're talking about a planned strategy here. Are they saying this was a way to, like, cut the military down to size?
Could be. And then you've got this other layer, right? The counteroffensive in 2023, the one everyone thought was going to be a game changer. Well, it didn't exactly deliver.
Right. I remember that. Lots of hype, not so much payoff.
Exactly. So maybe they needed a scapegoat. And the military, with its already shaky reputation, was the perfect target.
Yeah, I can see how that fits. But then they did something that seems like it would only make things worse. They fired all the military recruitment officers and replaced them with soldiers straight from the front lines.
Right. Like, talk about pouring gasoline on a fire. You're taking guys who've seen the worst of it, who are probably dealing with all sorts of trauma, and you're putting them in charge of forcing others to join the fight.
I mean, wouldn't that just escalate the tensions?
Totally. And it goes straight to the heart of this whole forced mobilization debate. The UN put out this report. They're really worried about these Ukrainian prisoners of war potentially being executed. They've documented, like, dozens of incidents, deaths since August.
Oh, man. That's just awful. But making connected to forcing people into the military.
Well, the UN's saying they haven't...
You fool me twice.
Sure, that they're limited in what they can observe and report. So the actual number of incidents could be way, way higher.
So you're saying forcing people to fight might actually be leading to more deaths. That's pretty heavy.
It's something to think about. If someone's forced into the military, are they going to be a good soldier? Or are they more likely to just give up? Or even switch sides.
Yeah, I see your point. That's some seriously scary stuff. And it makes you wonder about the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
About how Ukraine's being seen on the world stage with all this going on.
Right, because on the one hand, they're projecting this image to their allies like, we're strong, we got this, we're independent. But then you look at what's happening inside the country, and it's a whole different story.
It's like they're putting on a brave face for the cameras, but behind the scenes, things are falling apart.
Kinda, yeah. And this is where things get even more controversial. There are some claiming that Ukraine hasn't been holding up its end of the bargain, you know, the agreements it made with its Western allies.
And this is while they're asking for more and more support.
Yep. And get this, some are even saying that Russia has been more reliable in sticking to its commitments.
Wow, that's not something you hear every day. But how does what's happening inside Ukraine affect its ability to keep those promises it made?
Well, think about things like the tuberculosis epidemic, right?
Yeah.
You need foreign aid to tackle stuff like that. And when a country is so reliant on handouts, it raises questions, right? About their credibility, their ability to negotiate on equal footing.
Yeah, I can see how that creates a kind of vicious cycle.
Yeah.
But what about the big elephant in the room? What about NATO?
Ah, yes, NATO. Always a hot topic. This is going to be delicate, but there's this idea that joining NATO, well, it might have been dangled as a carrot, a way to keep the Ukrainian public on board, even though the people in charge knew it probably wasn't going to happen.
So like a promise made, but not really meant to be kept.
Yeah, kind of. And remember that statement Zelensky made recently?
The one about.
Yeah, where it seemed like he was admitting that they were led on about NATO, that they were told it was a real possibility when it wasn't.
Right, that was a big deal. It almost felt like a confession.
And it all ties back into this idea that Ukraine's been misreading the situation, misjudging its place in the world, making decisions based on faulty assumptions.
And now they're stuck dealing with the fallout.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really critical juncture. The elections that are coming up in Ukraine. There are some pretty influential people, a former U.S. official even, who think these elections are the key to any kind of lasting peace.
Elections in the middle of a war, that's a bold move. Why do they think it's so important?
They're saying that any peace deal that Zelensky signs, well, the people might not see it as legitimate, like he doesn't really have the authority. They're arguing that the only way to get a peace agreement that truly represents what the people want is to have new leadership elected by the people.
So it's about making sure the people have a voice, even in the middle of all this chaos.
Exactly. And they're drawing a parallel here to the elections that were held in South Vietnam back during the Vietnam War.
Interesting. So they're saying that even in a time of war, democracy still matters. That's a powerful statement. But you mentioned there's resistance to this idea.
Oh, yeah. There are a lot of people inside Ukraine who do not want to have elections right now. A former Ukrainian president even said holding elections would be like tearing the country apart.
So it's a real balancing act then. The need for democracy, but the fear of pushing the country further into chaos.
For sure. And it gets even messier because there are allegations that some people are being specifically targeted, excluded from participating in the elections. In fact, one of the people we're hearing from in this conversation claims to be one of those targets.
Whoa, okay. That takes things to a whole other level. What happens if they try to control the elections like that? What are the consequences?
Well, there could be some serious blowback, legally and politically. Western powers might not recognize the results of an election they see as rigged, and that could isolate Ukraine even more on the world stage.
So a high-stakes gamble with potentially disastrous consequences. But we haven't even touched on the role of foreign aid in all of this, especially from the U.S. What's going on there?
Well, that's where things get even murkier. There are accusations flying around that a huge chunk of the money meant for Ukraine, we're talking billions here, has been misused, even stolen.
Misused? How? Where's all this money going?
There's this one example that keeps coming up. It's this Ukrainian state-funded media channel that apparently got millions in aid, but almost nobody was watching it.
Wait, they're throwing money at a media outlet that nobody even sees. That doesn't sound like a very good return on investment.
It's being used as a prime example of how messed up things are, how some organizations and individuals have been lining their pockets with this aid money instead of using it to actually help people.
So not exactly the picture of international cooperation and goodwill that we usually see in the news.
Nope. And it gets even more interesting because the speaker we're hearing from is talking about their own personal contributions to the war effort.
So now we're getting into the personal stories, the individual experiences within this bigger conflict.
Yeah, exactly. And it highlights another layer of complexity, the changing political situation in the U.S. There are more and more politicians who are starting to question whether the U.S. should keep giving so much aid to Ukraine.
Why? What's driving that shift?
Well, there's all this talk about how the aid is being used or misused, as we've been discussing. And there's a growing feeling that Ukraine needs to step up, show that they're serious about tackling corruption and making sure the aid is being used responsibly.
So they're saying shape up or ship out.
Kind of, yeah. There's a sense that the unconditional support that Ukraine's enjoyed, well, it might be drying up.
So Ukraine's got a lot on its plate. They need to find a way to stand on their own 2 feet. And fast, but they're also facing this growing distrust from their allies. It's a tough spot to be in.
For sure. And that's where this idea of subjectivity comes in. The idea that Ukraine needs to figure out how to be its own master. One of the speakers even goes so far as to say that they should consider negotiating directly with Russia.
Ooh, hold on. Directly with Russia.
Yeah.
The people who invaded them, that seems incredibly risky, to put it mildly.
Risky, definitely. But it would also be a major power move. It's about taking control, not waiting for someone else to decide your fate. The other path they suggest is building stronger ties with other global players like China, India, the Arab states.
So not putting all their eggs in one basket, making sure they have options.
Exactly. But here's the catch. The thing that seems to be missing from Ukraine's approach right now, it's honesty. A willingness to look in the mirror and admit where they've messed up.
It's hard to admit you're not perfect, especially when you're fighting for your survival. But are they saying that Ukraine hasn't been a good partner?
That's the perception, yeah. There's this feeling that they've been all about demanding help, but not so much about doing their part.
Like asking for a free ride without putting in any effort.
That's a simple way to put it, but yeah. And they're saying Western leaders are starting to get wise to this. They're asking why they should keep supporting a country that doesn't seem to be pulling its weight.
That's a tough question to answer. And it gets even more complicated when you think about the whole conscription thing. You're asking for billions of dollars to fight a war, but you're not even willing to ask your own 18-year-olds to serve. That's going to raise some eyebrows, right?
No doubt. It makes you question how serious they really are about this whole existential threat thing. They even go so far as to say that this inconsistency makes it seem like Ukraine is either totally naive or they're deliberately trying to play their allies for fools.
Ouch. That's a harsh assessment.
Yeah.
But does it mean they're losing support? Is that what they're saying?
There are definitely signs that people are getting skeptical. Figures like Donald Trump and Elon Musk, they're becoming more vocal about their doubts about giving Ukraine a blank check.
And it's not just about the military aid, is it? This whole controversy with USA aid and then potentially pulling out, it seems like a sign that the West's willingness to help is starting to waver.
It's a wake-up call, for sure. Like they're saying, get your act together if you want our help.
Okay, so Ukraine's got to figure out how to stand on its own 2 feet, and quickly.
Yeah.
But they've also got this growing distrust from their allies to deal with. It's a lot to handle.
Yeah, it is. And that's where this idea of subjectivity becomes even more important. This idea of figuring out what it means to be Ukrainian, independent of outside influence. They make this interesting distinction. They say Ukraine's part of Europe, but not part of the West.
Huh. That's interesting. What do they mean by that? Is it just about geography?
It's deeper than that. They're saying that culturally, politically, Ukraine is fundamentally different from the West. Like they just don't fit into institutions like the European Union.
So even if they wanted to be fully accepted by the West, it might not even be possible.
That's their point, yeah. And they use examples like the conflicts with European farmers over agricultural imports to illustrate that.
Yeah, the economic realities clashing with the political aspirations.
Exactly. And they also talk about this deep-seated cultural preference in Ukraine for individual freedom over authority, over institutions.
So it's a clash of values, a different way of looking at the world.
You got it. And they use this really striking analogy to describe Ukraine's current strategy. They say it's like someone playing checkers when their opponents are playing chess.
Ouch, that's gonna sting. So they're saying that Ukraine is so focused on its own little corner of the board that it's missing the bigger picture, the strategic moves that are happening on a global scale.
That's how they see it. And they believe this tunnel vision has led to some major miscalculations, like banking on NATO membership as the cornerstone of their security strategy.
Yeah, they're really hammering home this idea that Ukraine has been sold a false bill of goods.
And they don't hold back in criticizing the Ukrainian leadership for perpetuating this illusion, especially after Zelensky himself admitted they were wrong about NATO.
So there's this feeling of betrayal, like the people in charge haven't been straight with them.
Definitely. And they use another analogy that's even more cutting. They describe Ukraine as a drunken teenager crashing a G7 summit, making demands and threats without realizing how out of place and ridiculous they look.
Wow, that's not very flattering. Are they saying that Ukraine is being seen as a liability, a nuisance, rather than a partner?
That's the harsh truth they're laying out. They say the West, while they admire Ukraine's fighting spirit, they're starting to see through the facade. They're realizing that there's a gap between what Ukraine says and what it does.
So back to this idea of subjectivity. They're saying the only way for Ukraine to earn respect, to have real leverage on the world stage, is to act like a grown-up, a reliable partner.
That's it. And they give some concrete examples of what that might look like. Things like leveraging Ukraine's resources, like rare earth metals, to strike up partnerships that benefit both sides, particularly with countries like the United States.
So finding ways to be an asset, not just a recipient of aid.
Exactly. But now this next part might get a little sensitive. They bring up the situation of Native Americans during the colonization of the Americas.
Okay, that's a heavy topic. How do they connect that to what's happening in Ukraine?
They're saying that Ukraine, just like the Native Americans, is caught in the middle of a power struggle between much bigger forces, and their interests are being ignored.
So even in a conflict that's often portrayed as good versus evil, there are other forces at play, more complex ones, and the people caught in the middle, well, they don't always come out on top.
That's what they're getting at, yeah. They even suggest that Ukraine, like the Native Americans, might be used and then abandoned once they're no longer usable in this bigger game.
That's a scary thought. A reminder that maybe you shouldn't put all your faith in the promises of powerful allies.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the media's role in all of this. The speakers are really critical of Ukrainian media outlets that they see as being too dependent on Western funding.
So they're saying these outlets might not be objective, that they might be pushing a narrative that benefits the West more than Ukraine.
That's the argument, yep. They're accusing these outlets of stirring up divisions within Ukraine, demonizing anyone who disagrees with them, and going for sensationalism instead of real analysis.
So they're basically saying it's propaganda, not journalism.
That's their take. And it's not just the media. They also call out what they call grant eaters. These individuals and organizations that they say have gotten rich off of Western aid without actually doing anything helpful for Ukraine.
So they're saying there's a whole system of people who are profiting from this war, using it to enrich themselves.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
And they're especially angry about what they see as hypocrisy, these people preaching about patriotism while lining their own pockets.
Which is a stark contrast to how the speakers are portraying themselves, right? They're talking about the sacrifices they've made, the contributions they've made to the war effort. It's like they're saying, we're putting our lives on the line while these people are getting rich.
Exactly. And they highlight one case in particular, this state-funded media channel that received millions of dollars in aid, but had a tiny, tiny audience.
Wait, so they're pouring money into a media outlet that no one even watches? What's the point of that?
They're using it as a prime example of the waste and corruption that's going on in the Ukrainian government. They're saying this channel was basically a way for some people to get rich, not a real public service.
So it's not just about the big geopolitical games being played. It's also about the smaller scale corruption that's eating away at trust and hurting the war effort.
That's their perspective.
Yeah.
And it leads to this big question. What happens when the West stops sending money?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What happens when the well runs dry?
They seem to think that Ukraine is going to have to become a lot more self-reliant, and they're not sure if the country's ready for that. They're worried that if USAID pulls out, for example, it's going to expose how fragile a lot of Ukrainian institutions are, how dependent they've become on foreign funding.
It's like a kid who's always had everything handed to them, suddenly having to make their own way in the world.
Exactly. And they're saying that whether Ukraine sinks or swims depends on whether it can ditch this attitude of entitlement and dependency and adopt a more realistic, self-sufficient approach.
So it's not just about policy changes, it's about a whole change in mindset.
That's the point. And there's another big theme that keeps coming up.
Yeah.
Unity within Ukraine.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges from outside, the complicated geopolitical situation, the need for Ukraine to stand on its own 2 feet. But they're also saying that Ukraine needs to figure out how to heal its own internal divisions.
Yep, that's the message. They're worried that focusing so much on external enemies like Russia has blinded a lot of Ukrainians to the problems that are dividing them from the inside.
Like, a house divided against itself cannot stand, right? Especially when it's facing a threat to its very existence. What kind of divisions are we talking about here?
They point to the tension between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, the fact that certain religious groups are being suppressed, and the way people who have different political views are being marginalized.
So it's not just about language. It's about different cultures, different beliefs, different visions for what Ukraine should be.
Exactly. And their argument is that these internal divisions are being exploited by outside forces, making it even harder for Ukraine to present a united front.
So it's a double whammy, right? Yeah. Heal the divisions at home while fending off pressure from abroad. That's a tough ask.
No doubt. And what they're calling for is a more inclusive, tolerant approach to nation building, one that embraces diversity and chooses dialogue over demonization.
So finding strength in their differences, not letting those differences tear them apart. It's a powerful message, but the question is, will it resonate in all this chaos?
That's something we'll explore further as we get into the next part of this deep dive.
Sounds good to me.
It all boils down to this idea of subjectivity, you know? A nation's ability to act on its own, make its own choices, without being controlled by someone else.
So they're saying Ukraine needs to find a way to stand on its own 2 feet, call its own shots. But how can they do that when they're in the middle of a war, when they're so reliant on help from others?
That's the big question, isn't it? One of the speakers even suggests that Ukraine should think about negotiating directly with Russia.
Seriously. Directly with Russia.
Yeah.
The country that invaded them. That just seems, I don't know, incredibly dangerous, to say the least.
Yeah, risky for sure. But it would also be a huge statement. It's about taking charge of your own destiny, not waiting for someone else to hand it to you. The other way they talk about achieving subjectivity is by forming alliances with other powerful countries like China, India, the Arab states.
So spreading the risk, not relying on just one or two countries for support.
Right. But there's this one key ingredient that seems to be missing from Ukraine's approach so far, and that's honesty. They need to be willing to take a hard look at themselves and admit where they've messed up.
It's hard to admit you're not perfect, especially when you're in a fight for your life. But are they saying that Ukraine hasn't been a reliable partner?
That's the perception they're highlighting. There's this feeling out there that Ukraine has been all about demanding help, but not so much about holding up their end of the deal.
It's like asking for a handout without being willing to work for it.
Yeah, you could put it that way. And they're saying that Western leaders are starting to notice this. They're asking why they should keep pouring resources into a country that doesn't seem to be pulling its weight.
That's a tough question to confront.
Yeah.
And it gets even trickier when you factor in the whole conscription issue. If you're asking for billions of dollars to help you fight a war, but you're not even willing to ask your own 18-year-olds to serve, that's going to raise some red flags, right?
Absolutely. It challenges this whole narrative of Ukraine as a desperate nation fighting for its survival. They even go so far as to say that this inconsistency makes it seem like Ukraine is either incredibly naive or they're deliberately playing their allies for fools.
That's a pretty brutal assessment.
Yeah.
But are they saying that Ukraine is losing support because of this?
There are definitely signs that people are becoming more and more skeptical. People like Donald Trump and Elon Musk, they're getting louder about their doubts about continuing to support Ukraine unconditionally.
And it's not just about the military aid either, right? This whole thing with USAID and them possibly shutting down their programs in Ukraine, it seems like a sign that the West is starting to rethink its commitment to helping.
It's a big warning sign for sure. It's like they're saying, get your house in order or we're out.
So Ukraine has to figure out how to stand on its own 2 feet. And fast. But they're also dealing with this growing distrust from their allies. It's a tough situation all around.
No doubt about it. And that's where this idea of subjectivity becomes even more critical. They make this interesting distinction. They say Ukraine is part of Europe, but not part of the West.
Okay. What do they mean by that? Is it just geographical thing?
It's more than that. They're saying that culturally and politically, Ukraine is just wired differently from the West. Like, they don't really fit in with institutions like the European Union.
So even if they wanted to be fully embraced by the West, it might not even be possible.
That's their argument. And they use things like the conflicts with European farmers over agricultural imports as evidence.
Right. The economic realities clashing with the political aspirations.
Yeah.
What else do they point to?
They also talk about this deeply ingrained cultural preference in Ukraine for individual freedom, for autonomy over institutions and authority.
So a clash of values, a fundamentally different way of looking at the world.
You got it. They even use this really striking analogy. They describe Ukraine's approach as being like someone who's playing checkers while their opponents are playing chess.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt. So they're saying Ukraine's so focused on its own narrow perspective that it's missing the bigger picture, the strategic moves that are happening on a global scale.
That's their assessment. And they think this inability to see the whole board has led to some serious blunders, especially this whole thing about relying on NATO membership as the foundation of their security strategy.
They're really driving home this point that Ukraine has been misled, that they've been chasing a promise that was never really there.
And they're pretty harsh in their criticism of the Ukrainian leadership for feeding this false hope, especially after Zelensky himself admitted that they were wrong about NATO.
So there's this sense of betrayal, like the people in charge haven't been honest with them.
For sure. And they use another analogy, one that's even more brutal. They describe Ukraine as a drunken teenager crashing a G7 summit, making demands and throwing threats around without realizing how out of place and ineffective they look.
Wow, that's... yeah, not a good look. Are they saying that Ukraine is coming across as a nuisance, a burden, rather than a partner?
That's the harsh reality they're presenting. They're saying that while the West admires Ukraine's fighting spirit, They're starting to see through the act. They're recognizing the gap between what Ukraine says and what it actually does.
So back to this idea of subjectivity. They're saying that the only way for Ukraine to gain respect, to have real influence on the world stage, is to act like a responsible adult, a reliable partner.
Exactly. And they offer some concrete examples of what that might look like. Things like leveraging Ukraine's resources, like their rare earth metals, to forge partnerships that are mutually beneficial, especially with countries like the United States.
So finding ways to be an asset, not just a beneficiary.
Right. But now, this next part might be a bit sensitive. They make a comparison to the plight of Native Americans during the colonization of the Americas.
Okay, that's a heavy topic. How do they tie that in to what's happening in Ukraine?
They're arguing that Ukraine, just like the Native Americans, is caught in the middle of a power struggle between much larger forces, and their own interests are being pushed aside.
So even in a conflict that's often framed as good versus evil, there are these other more complex dynamics at play, and the people who get caught in the middle, well, they don't always come out on top.
That's their point. They even go so far as to suggest that Ukraine, just like the Native Americans, might be exploited and then abandoned once they're no longer useful to the bigger players.
That's a sobering thought, a reminder that maybe you shouldn't put all your faith in the promises of powerful allies.
Now let's turn our attention to the media's role in all of this. The speakers are really critical of Ukrainian media outlets that they see as being too reliant on Western funding.
So they're questioning the objectivity of these outlets, suggesting that they might be pushing a narrative that benefits the West more than it benefits Ukraine.
That's the argument. They're accusing these outlets of stirring up division within Ukraine, demonizing anyone who disagrees with them, and going for sensationalism instead of real analysis.
So they're basically saying it's propaganda, not journalism.
That's their take, yeah. And this criticism doesn't stop at the media. They also target what they call grand eaters, these individuals and organizations that they claim have gotten rich off Western aid without actually contributing anything meaningful to Ukraine.
So they're saying there's a whole ecosystem of people who are profiting from this war, using it to enrich themselves.
That's their contention. And what really gets to them is what they see as hypocrisy. These people lecturing everyone about patriotism while they're lining their own pockets.
Which is a stark contrast to how the speakers are portraying themselves, right? They're emphasizing the personal sacrifices they've made, the contributions they made to the war effort. It's like they're saying, we're putting our lives on the line while these people are getting rich.
Exactly. And they use this one specific example, this state-funded media channel that got millions of dollars in aid despite having a minuscule audience.
Wait. They're pouring money into a media outlet that almost no one is watching. What's the point of that?
They're using it as a perfect example of the waste and mismanagement that's happening in the Ukrainian government. They're saying this channel was basically a vehicle for some people to enrich themselves, not a genuine public service.
So it's not just about the big geopolitical games that are being played. It's also about the smaller scale corruption that's eroding trust and undermining the war effort from within.
That's their perspective. And it leads to this really important question. What happens when the West turns off the money tap?
Yeah, that's the big unknown, isn't it?
Yeah.
What happens when the well runs dry?
They seem to think that Ukraine is going to have to become a lot more self-reliant, and they're not convinced the country is ready for that. They worry that if USAID pulls out, for example, it's going to expose just how fragile a lot of Ukrainian institutions are, how dependent they've become on foreign funding.
It's like a child who's always had everything handed to them, suddenly having to make it on their own.
And they say that whether Ukraine sinks or swims depends on whether it can shake off this sense of entitlement, this dependency, and embrace a more realistic, self-sufficient approach.
So it's not just about changing policies, it's about a fundamental shift in mindset.
Exactly. And there's another big theme that keeps coming up. The need for unity within Ukraine.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges from outside, the complex geopolitical situation, the need for Ukraine to become more self-reliant. But they're also saying that Ukraine needs to find a way to heal the divisions within its own society.
That's their message, yeah. They worry that this constant focus on external enemies like Russia has blinded a lot of Ukrainians to the problems that are dividing them from the inside.
Like a house divided against itself cannot stand, right? Especially when it's facing an existential threat. What kinds of divisions are they talking about?
They point to the tension between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, the suppression of certain religious groups, and the marginalization of people with different political views.
So it's not just about language, it's about different cultures, different beliefs, different ideas about what Ukraine should be.
Exactly. And they believe that these internal divisions are being exploited by outside forces, making it even harder for Ukraine to present a united front.
So these had a double challenge then.
Yeah.
Heal the divisions at home while dealing with pressure from abroad.
That's the situation. And what they're calling for is a more inclusive, tolerant approach to building their nation, one that embraces diversity and chooses dialogue over demonization.
So finding strength in their differences instead of letting those differences tear them apart, that's a powerful idea. But the question is, will it resonate? Especially in the midst of all this chaos.
That's something we'll explore further as we dive into the final part of this deep dive.
So we've talked about Ukraine needing to forge its own path, become more self-reliant, and address the divisions within its society. But where does the leadership fit into all of this? Where does Zelensky stand?
That's where things get really interesting. They make this bold claim, see? They say Zelensky, he knows how this whole thing is going to play out. He knows the limits of Ukraine's position, but he's telling a different story to the public.
Wait, they're saying Zelensky's straight up lying to the Ukrainian people? That's a pretty serious accusation. What makes them think that?
They point to his public statements about negotiating with guys like Donald Trump. They're saying those statements are totally detached from reality. I mean, why would the leader of a country that's fighting for its survival feel the need to lecture a former U.S. president on international relations?
Yeah, it does seem a little out of place, especially given, well, who has the power in that situation? Are they implying that Zelensky's more concerned with his image than with the actual needs of the country?
That's the suggestion. And they also bring up that thing Zelensky said recently about Ukraine being misled about joining NATO. They're framing it as him admitting that he's been spinning a false narrative.
So it comes down to trust, to being honest with the people. If the leadership knows something they're not sharing, well, does that mean they're really representing the people's interests?
It raises some tough questions for sure. And it leads to this fascinating point they make about how to judge a situation. They say one of the best ways to figure out what's really going on is to look at how the people involved are perceived by others.
So step outside your own bubble and see how your actions look to people who aren't invested in your story.
Exactly. And they argue that the Ukrainian leadership, they've been so focused on getting support from the West that they haven't stopped to think about how their behavior might look to the people they're asking for help from.
Sometimes you got to think about how you're coming across, especially when you're asking for a favor.
Right. And they say that constantly begging for assistance without showing any willingness to be self-reliant or to compromise, well, it's starting to wear thin on some Western leaders.
Nobody likes to feel like they're being used, especially when they're making sacrifices to help someone out.
And that brings us to a really important point. This idea that Ukraine is corrupt and mismanaged, well, that's a big problem for them if they want to get long-term support from the international community.
It's a hard truth to face, but it's something they need to deal with.
They're saying that all these recent stories about misused aid, well, it just makes this problem even worse. It's harder for Ukraine to make a case for more help when people are questioning how they're using the help they've already gotten.
Yeah, it's like that saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Exactly. And they're saying that if Ukraine wants to earn back that trust, they need to take real action, not just make promises. More transparency, more accountability, a real effort to get rid of corruption.
Actions speak louder than words, right?
Yeah.
They need to show that the aid they're getting is being used properly.
Now, let's look at another thing they bring up about Ukraine's political system. They say that because Ukraine has a history of revolutions and power struggles, well, it's created this culture of instability and distrust. And that makes it really hard to govern effectively and to build a strong national identity.
So they're saying that the way power has changed hands in the past, it's still affecting them today.
That's the idea. They're saying that because there hasn't been a strong tradition of peaceful transitions of power, it creates this atmosphere of uncertainty and volatility. That makes it hard to plan for the long term and to have consistent policies.
It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand, right?
Yeah.
You need a solid foundation to create something that lasts.
And their point is that to get over this, Ukraine needs to strengthen its democratic institutions, create a culture of accountability, and make sure that the rule of law is upheld even when things get tough.
So it's about creating a system where power is transferred peacefully and transparently, not through shady deals or violence.
Now, they use this really interesting analogy here. They compare Ukrainian society right now to a family that's been torn apart by a bad relationship.
That's a powerful image. It really gets across the emotional damage this conflict has caused.
They're saying that this constant flood of propaganda, this demonization of anyone who disagrees, this focus on enemies, well, it's created a climate of fear and suspicion and resentment within Ukraine.
It's like a poison, right?
Yeah.
Something that seeps into everything, eats away at trust, and makes it hard for people to connect with each other.
Their point is that to heal these wounds, they need to make a conscious effort to have real conversations, to understand each other, and to rebuild a sense of shared purpose.
So remembering that even people who disagree about politics are still Ukrainians, and their voices matter.
Exactly. And they stress how important it is to focus on what unites Ukrainians, to find common ground, and to build a vision for the future that goes beyond the pain of the past.
So finding strength in their diversity, recognizing that real power comes from working together, from combining the strengths of all the different people who make up Ukraine.
And that brings us to their final assessment of the challenges ahead. It's a pretty sobering picture, but they do offer a glimmer of hope.
So they're acknowledging how difficult things are, but they're also saying that there's still a chance for a better future.
They're arguing that if Ukraine wants to survive in this new world order, they need a fundamental change in mindset. They need to go from feeling weak and dependent to feeling strong and self-reliant.
It's about taking control of your own fate, not letting other people decide what happens to you.
They're emphasizing pragmatism over idealism. They're saying the world isn't always fair, you know? Sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect yourself.
It's about being realistic about your situation and making the best of the cards you've been dealt.
And they also talk about the importance of unity and resilience, recognizing that the road ahead is going to be long and tough, and they're going to need everyone to work together to succeed.
It's about putting aside petty disagreements and focusing on building a stronger, more independent, more prosperous Ukraine.
And they leave us with this thought-provoking question. Can Ukraine overcome its internal divisions, shed its reliance on others, and find a more pragmatic, self-sufficient approach to create a better future for its people?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's clear that the situation in Ukraine is far more complicated than what we usually hear on the news. We've explored the tensions within Ukrainian society, the challenges of navigating the global political landscape, and the difficult decisions they face going forward. It's important to remember that these are just some of the viewpoints on this complex issue. Our goal was to share these perspectives with you and let you form your own opinions. The situation in Ukraine is always changing, and we encourage you to keep learning and stay engaged with different viewpoints as things develop. Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.